Hello everybody and welcome to week 5. If you hear a playful dog growling in the background, that's just my Maltese, so just ignore that. And I'm looking very close at the screen because I keep trying to get rid of the glare on my glasses, so my apologies for that. But this week we're looking at the English School of Thought. It's one of my favorites because another course that I teach and actually coordinate is called Conflict Resolution. I'm sure I will see some of you in conflict resolution or have already. And the English School is actually the foundation of that particular area of study. So some of the main scholars in the English School are people like Hedley Bull and Barry Buzan. So they're probably people that you might look at if you get involved in this theory to any extent. So it's a body of thought really designed to come up with theory to explain a changing world from, as I said, those days of classical realism and liberalism, and to guide our thinking with regards to humanitarian intervention. How should it be carried out? Is it a good idea? Isn't it a good idea? How do you intervene in terms of humanitarian intervention without stepping over lines in terms of global stability and the world order? So this is basically what the English School is designed to do, and it was emerged from a group of scholars, I understand, at a university, no doubt over in the UK, and hence the name. So there's a couple of different strands when it comes to the English School. There's the pluralist strand, which emphasises the differences in states, including ethnic differences, obviously, and how you manage affairs given these differences. So the idea is that for international order to be maintained, it requires some type of consensus, and therefore you get organisations like the United Nations that are there to help forge that consensus, and they come up with norms and ideas to help establish order and a set of rules. But it is a fragile consensus. So this is one strand of thought, the English School. And then you have Solidarism, which talks about global security and norms, and it's often considered more of an idealist view because it looks at the idea that we're a cosmopolitan or a global society, I should say. So it leads to this idea of universal fundamental human rights as a liberal ideal that we should all aspire to. So I suppose if you look at the solidarist idea from the English School, you're more likely to see things like less restrictions around immigration, refugee flows, humanitarian intervention being led by humanitarian need, as opposed to other realist concerns, like sometimes humanitarian intervention happens in places where there's concerns over terrorism. Well, that's more of a realist-driven agenda. Now, how countries manage aid is really interesting. So you have things like the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. Now, that would be ideally based on this idea of a global society and a more solidarist view. But in reality, a lot of countries take a very realist approach to aid, including Australia. So, for example, a lot of our aid is more likely to go to our Pacific neighbours and someone over in Africa. Not to say zero aid would go over to Africa, but if you ever had a look at charts around the amount of aid that goes out of Australia, you'll see the vast proportion goes to our neighbouring countries, as opposed to just simply based on dire humanitarian need. So that's an idea of a more realist approach. And so probably moving away from a global society where we look at humans not in terms of borders, but just as basic human beings with universal rights to be educated, to be fed, etc. But like I said, most countries really fall somewhere between those two spectrums. So they're just some of my thoughts on the English School. I think it's a really interesting issue, and we're starting to come up to discussion on, some of the theory that would be very applicable to what we see in the news and probably to the world we live in today, and particularly with so many things going on in Syria and the Middle East, and discussion around when should a country intervene in another nation's affairs and when shouldn't it. So this is where your theories will start to become very useful, hopefully, and you can apply them to some real world events. So don't forget, just to recap, for your main argument post, your 250 words, you should have talk about strengths, talk about weaknesses, come up with your own views, ideally use one or two real life examples, and always reference using scholarly research. We would hope to see some of the key scholars in there and maybe someone else. I think posts that have referenced about 3 different scholars are usually quite strong. But like I said, it's not like we're counting, it just shows often in the depth of critique. And then your response post is only a shorter 150 words. You're actually responding to someone's prompt question, and you're also going to use references in your response post. Feel free to use the research that you have already done. So we're almost halfway to Consolidation Week and to having a nice long break. So keep asking questions. I'm enjoying reading the discussions and being part of them to the extent that I can. But I think you're learning from each other as well. And that's great because some of those responses and main critical posts I could not have done better myself. So I'm really impressed. And I learned something from hearing your thinking as well. So have a good week.